How many of you guys know this guy? I can give you a clue. He was a decorated coal miner. And in preschool, I wore one of these Polish coal miner hats. It was one of the most embarrassing photos ever taken, which I will not show to you here. He was also the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, ruled this country when most of you were not alive. And he's the leading character of my earliest political memories. Every night I used to watch the evening news with my parents, and we played this game. Where did Edward Gerek, this is his name, where did he go today? It was always the top item of the news. Did the communist Waldo go to a hospital or to a coal mine? Or probably Moscow. He went to Moscow quite a bit. The 70s in this country, which I remember and most of you do not, seemed like a pretty happy time, relatively speaking, from the point of view of a child in single digits age. There were these things called TEDx stores where you could buy Tic Tacs. There were these hard currency stores. There was a lot of easy money around. I remember bought this little thing called the maluch. It's a small Polish fiat. And Polish politics was very stable. It was very boring. And next door in our fine eastern neighbor was passing through also the stolid gray years of Leonid Brezhnev. Even more boring. Then came along this man. Haben muss papen was this voice that I still remember over the phone from a uncle of ours who was living in Paris, calling us late one night in 1978. We have a pope, and meaning not that we Catholics, but really we Poles. And then 2 years later came this man, and things stopped being boring in this country. We used to listen to Radio Free Europe, my grandfather's door, strikes everywhere. There was really the latest and the most significant rumbling of what seemed the supposedly eternal Soviet imperium. Then came martial law, of course. That's just a very quick history lesson, if you don't mind. The generals have lost their patience, I wrote on December 13th, 1981. It was the first sentence of my very first news article in my very first publication. It was Washington Press was the name of the thing, and it's unforgivable that that lead had a passive tone in the lead, but otherwise I think it captured the drama pretty well. We had a circulation of about 6 relatives were included. And for the next few years, for a decade really, Poland captivated the world. Everyone was engaged in my country's story. Every few weeks in Washington, we used to go on these marches, starting at the AFL-CIO building and ending up at Lafayette Park near the White House. And by the summer of 1989, it kind of came to this great climax, and of course the fall, with the fall of the wall. Has anything really changed? Asked a journalist of Tadeusz Mazowiecki. And I was here that summer. I remember he replied, Madam, it was a female journalist, how can you ask, has anything changed if this country has just appointed its first non-communist prime minister in over 40 years? So the rest is history, the end of history, if you will. I don't know how many of you guys know this guy. To be fair, Frank Fukuyama did put a question mark in his famous End of History essay when it was first published in Foreign Affairs. The one that sort of wondered whether liberal democracy and the free market system had triumphed once and for all with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, I imagine there was probably a zealous literary agent who convinced Frank to drop the question mark from the book version of the article that I'm sure he got a very nice advance for, but he probably regrets it now. But anyway, at the time, it seemed like we were back to boring, but in the now expanded West, but a slightly different kind of boring. There were these guys. There they are signing, and everyone in this room, I assume you've been taught who this is since you go to the College of Europe. They're signing the Treaty of Maastricht, which they created the single currency, the euro. And here we have a similar crowd in Amsterdam, where they made it possible for the EU to take in new members from the East. Now, these guys drew up the design for our post-Berlin Europe, which was supposed to be capped by a constitution. The EU's Philadelphia moment. There was a guy named Giscard d'Estaing, the French president, who was playing the role of James Madison to really solidify the stable new creation. Now, this period, 1990 to 2005, I was thinking, you might call it the glorious 15 or the boring 15. Not stable, boring, quite like the Brezhnev-Garrick era of my childhood, but there was this similar feeling of this is the way it must be and will be, and history has reached perhaps not the very end, but some kind of equilibrium where we're just kind of coast on through, and that was really the mood back then. I mean, yes, there was 9/11, you had the Rwanda genocide, the war in the Balkans, a burst tech bubble, all kinds of things kept happening, but really fundamentally, people who lived in this new enlarged West never felt as safe or as prosperous and felt they were kind of living in a stable zone. There's a hubris in our ruling class. On Europe, we were on Venus, the Americans were on Mars, as one pundit put it at the time, but we were all really abiding with something called the Washington Consensus. And when I was living at a time in the late 90s was Brussels, there's also a Brussels Consensus. Now, these guys from Maastricht, again, these guys, they knew what they were doing, right? Better than mere mortals. As did Europe's founders, Schuman and Monnet, again, in your books here at the College of Europe. You've learned all about them. Neither of whom have ever, by the way, ran for office, much less held really elected office, but they were the kind of the founding fathers of this thing. And the public yawned, mostly. Boring. And sometimes it resented this kind of complex political construct, but very rarely engaged in what's going on here at the European level, even at the Western level. And the elites, frankly, preferred it that way because our Europe was boring by design. The thinking was Hitler wasn't boring, right? So let's try and do the reverse. So no real human beings, much less charismatic leaders, represented what Europe was going to become. Europe was, trade deals, directives about environmental emissions, trialogues, shadow rapporteurs. It was really the idea was to drown all these demons in this part of the world in cant, in technocracy, and we in the media, I'm talking about myself, and I was partly debating, I think we partly played along, and there was this feeling again in these kind of glorious / boring 15 years that Europe was, at best a great holiday destination, and at worst it was an aging, slowly growing giant, but nothing to fret about. The Middle East, Asia, even Africa, that's where the action was. That's where it was interesting. Everything that seemed impossible to imagine even 10 years ago, inconceivable, now seems a bit less so and perhaps even likely. Greece dropping out of the euro, the whole euro thing just collapsing. Britain dropping out of Europe. It might happen in 2 months, right? Spain splits in 2 or 3 parts. You have a major war with Russia, possibly. Liberal democracy in peril across Europe and actually very consciously being rejected. There's an ISIL's bringing the Middle East-style terrorism to our lands. I live in Brussels. We experienced it 2 weeks ago. So in short, no longer boring, right? So you see the pattern I'm trying to get at here, that in my lifetime, there were 2 periods of stable, and they were both followed up by upheaval. In the first, you have the authoritarian systems that they fail to muzzle nations who have ambitions, ideas, hopes for freedoms for good. And the interesting outcome here is that it led to more of the world becoming free than ever in human history. The second case is less common, but I think the second case of boredom is less common but more relevant to those of us who live in what still passes for Western democracies today. When we turn complacent, take things for granted, declare everything over, get bored by politics, interesting things happen afterwards. And so my upshot here, just to begin, is that boring politics is dangerous for whoever practices as well as consumes it, and that sooner or later things turn messy. Consider the parable of the 2 Maidans. So Maidan is actually an Arabic word, and it means square. There's one called Tahrir in central Cairo. There it is. It's not exactly beautiful. You see the Egyptian Museum there on the right. And the other one goes by the name of Nezavistimosty, Independence in Kiev. Though people now just simply call it the Maidan. Now, within 2 years of each other, these squares hosted a deeply unboring event, revolution. And I was lucky to be in both places, and I feel myself sort of fortunate to experience them because, in both you saw young people coming together. You had social media. You had this sort of pent-up frustration with sclerotic, corrupt politics. Frankly, after Sadat was killed in 1981, Cairo was really the most stable, politically boring place in all of the Middle East. It was kind of the death knell for any foreign correspondent. If you were posted in Cairo, you're like, oh God, nothing ever happens in Cairo. I got to travel a lot around the Middle East. And Kiev was merely the most corrupt country, sort of capital in Europe. So in both places, the ruler was eventually toppled and new elections were held. But the outcomes have been quite different, and I think it's worth dwelling on why. Tahrir was the picture of a nation united by desire to topple a strongman and seize power. You had various groups. You had the Muslim Brotherhood, you had the liberals, the middle classes, there was the Salafists, there was the Falul, the old establishment. But they were all trying to kind of get their peace, really. The Maidan was a different kind of place. It was in miniature for me, an ideal world where the Ukrainians imagined what kind of country they wanted to live in. It was incredibly sober. You couldn't even bring alcohol in the enclosure in central Kiev for those few months. It was incredibly clean. It was incredibly well organized, which is not a trait that Slavs generally, and I am Slav myself, are known for. It was civic. It was kind of meritocratic. It was an ideal, but and idealism and naivete are two sides of the same coin. But they had an ideal of what they wanted to be, and partly they were looking to this country, saying, look at Poland. They were similar to us once, and now they're very different. How did they get there? How did they get an accountable government? How did they get a growing economy? They had a more normal politics, and they wanted the EU. At a time where most of the EU doesn't want the EU or doesn't seem to want the EU, they were dreaming of the EU. Now, this is this is the first time anyone has ever died fighting for the EU flag, and this is because obviously it turned very bloody at the end. But this is the first time in history, and maybe the last, when people died for this supposedly boring European ideal. Tahrir was never about process or principles or consensus and compromise, or was not ever nearly enough. It was one group to try to squeeze the other out, in my view. There was barely talk of thinking about a Polish-style transition or a South African one. Each side wanted to seize power and to make the messy, and they saw it as messy now, to make it boring. Now, the military succeeded for now, and Egypt is not exceptional. Roughly half the countries that have become democratic have reversed course for at least a year. Kiev is still a mess. Politics is a daily struggle waged by many. It's occupied by Russia, run by oligarchs. All the problems. Yet the politics of the place is better than it was. There's an engagement in the politics. There's a kind of a good kind of mess. Now, Schumpeter said quite famously that you need creative destruction to have a healthy economy. Now, I would say that you need a creative messiness of your politics, and that is essential to our political health. It has to be the right kind of messy. It should never be boring. Now, these guys, they're a big part of my life these days. So when I agreed to help start a publication to cover this, Brussels, the EU, hashtag Team Juncker, he's a shorter guy there in the middle. I heard so often, how in the world are you going to make these guys interesting? It's the greatest place there is. It's also, I want to ask you to come back at me with a word, because it's not really, it would sort of defeat my purpose, but how do you make these guys interesting? And I think the answer here for us has been, well, it matters. It matters what these guys do. It matters what Europe does. It matters what your politics does. And we have a responsibility as engaged journalists to make it interesting. Not partisan, we don't have an agenda, this is political or national anyway, but to make it, to really sort of bring to life these politics there. And you have an obligation as engaged citizens to make them interesting. I promised we would never be captured by the place. There's no Brussels consensus for us. We would cover them as they deserve to be covered. We've been called a gossip house, by the way. We've also been called we practice peep show style journalism by President Juncker himself. It's really the nicest thing I've ever heard so far, and I hope we can measure up to that ambition. Now, I think actually the technocrats who defend the quote-unquote bubble of Brussels, who really do try and deaden the place with the awful cant, are a grave danger to their so-called project, because that deadening hand was supposed to suffocate some of these demons, end up creating new demons. And I don't say as a Europhile, Eurosceptic, but you're all familiar with what these demons are: populists, people who really want to bring the end of this thing. Now, I'm no political scientist, but my father is. And I spent some time as a journalist thinking about these things, in Africa and in the Americas. So here, the basic things. What do you need for healthy politics? Well, obviously, whether this is at a local, regional, European, global level, you need what? Legitimacy, that'd be a good thing, right? Accountability, functional institutions that happen to be legitimate, that's usually a good thing. Checks and balances, rule of law. There's a very interesting debate right now in Poland about these issues. Elections, probably not so much, just the process, but engaged politics, engaged media, and above all, creative messiness. An awareness that this is a daily struggle, as you see in Ukraine. You wage it or you lose it. Take nothing for granted. You assume nothing. I mean, how many times do we have to learn this lesson, especially on this continent, before we really heed it? Europe's mess now is more, I think, a more destructive than a creative kind. But at least the place is now interesting, and it deserves your mind, I think everyone's engagement. In times like this, people are said to want stability, but I don't really buy that, because that means authoritarianism, that means more boring politics, and that means upheaval, not always of the good kind. I happen to think that's really politics is what has always driven me in my journalism. I'm fascinated by it. It's really that we human beings deal with each other. It's really the force that gives us meaning. And I want to say, may you be lucky enough, to invert that famous saying, may you be lucky enough to live in interesting times, but I mean it sincerely. And may you take part in the creative messiness, because whether our politics is healthy or not, it's up to you.